So I'm going to open up the broadcast to let people join. I'll give 5 minutes for people to join in, and then I'll make a start. So, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar on building back faster and better amidst COVID-19. Is a green recovery possible? So the government white paper on reforming the planning system focuses on speeding things up. This includes moving to a rules-based planning system to give developers greater clarity on what development is acceptable, in which location, and what the environmental assessment process, and making, sorry, the environmental assessment process more efficient. But how does this marry up with the forthcoming mandatory approach to biodiversity net gain in the Environment Bill? Can we speed up the process of getting a development to construction and then operation, whilst not just improving the environmental outcomes, but also delivering genuine and meaningful long-term benefits for nature and people? In our webinar today, we have a panel who will discuss the risks, uncertainties, opportunities, and the green path we need to take to rebuild our economy in ways that tackle both the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis. We'd like today to be interactive, so I'd encourage you to use the question and answer function. So if you can pop questions in there, we will be going through a bit of a discussion in the panel, and we'll have a question session at the end, but please do pop questions into the Q&A function as we go through, and we'll get to those at the end. Yes, please use that function. So introducing today's panel, we've got Julia Baker, who is the Biodiversity Technical Specialist at Balfour Beatty. We've got Bob Edmonds, who's the Technical Director for Ecology at SLR Consulting. And we've got Richard Sagar, who's stepped in at a very last minute from Walker Morris for one of his other partners. So thank you very much, Richard. We've got Tom Butterworth, who's Technical Director for Natural Capital and Biodiversity at WSP. And myself, Jason Reeves, I'm the Head of Policy and Comms at CIEEM. So to start off today, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the planning reforms, and then we'll get into a bit more discussion how they link with other things, and the panel can have a conversation around how we fit it all together and how we move ahead in a building back in a green way. So we're talking about the Planning for the Future consultation for England, which closed in August. The main sort of claim or objective from the government on this is that the Town and Country Policy Act, being 70 odd years old, having been amended several times, is now complex and bureaucratic, and it's time for reform. The government describes this as a major overhaul for planning in England as a once in a generation reform. There's three key elements here that I'm just going to cover in this very brief intro. One's around speeding things up, the zoning proposals, and then changing to a rules-based system. So speeding things up. The planning reforms aim to drastically speed up the creation and adoption of local plans, planning decisions, and delivery. So speed, speed, speed. And a proposal to legislate to widen and change the nature of permitted development. So make those things that we understand and know, move them along more quickly and smoothly with less barriers. We've heard a lot about Project Speed and that response to COVID-19, building back the economy. We've heard about building back better and a green recovery, and we've had some very good things said from government and the Prime Minister at times. We've also had the unfounded new counting delays comment, which is unhelpful. And there's a very definite commitment from government to invest in infrastructure as well. So the zoning proposals. So the proposals for zoning would be incorporated into local plans, puts more onus on local planning authorities and gives them much shorter timeframes to bring forward local plans as well. And the general idea, though, is that everything would be zoned into three different areas: so growth, renewal, or protected. And I will go through each of those quickly now. So growth zones are suitable for substantial development. Substantial development, though, isn't defined, but the government do say in the proposal paper that would be defined, so there'd be a definition for that. And it includes land suitable for comprehensive development, including things like new towns, urban extensions, and redevelopments of brownfield sites. And that these areas would have outline approval for development in the local plans. The one nod to nature we get here is around flood risk, but that's about as much as we get. Renewal zones suitable for development as well, cover existing areas, but on a much smaller scale. Talk about the gentle densification, something else is not defined. So it's generally around infill though, and to some extent brownfield, and then smaller developments around, say, villages in or next to, so infill again. Also a statutory presumption in favour of development here as well. the little nod we get to nature in this one is around residential gardens, where local authorities would be able to resist that or have an option there. And then protected zones. So ideally, the area for nature and biodiversity, they'd be protected under particular environmental or cultural characteristics, undefined at this stage. And then we get this sort of odd collection of greenbelt AONBs, conservation areas, so different designations for things like amenity, landscape, biodiversity, all sort of lumped together, and gardens, sort of unhelpful. Yeah, so it includes areas of open countryside outside of those already that would have been in growth and renewal. So there's some uncertainty there. And these would be defined at a national level with local designation as well, but using the national policy and labeled obviously in local plans so that they're clearly signposted. So a rules-based system. So the current situation isn't rule-based, it's discretionary, it's a case-by-case basis, and government wants us to move to a rules-based system for planning. Their argument is that the English planning system is an exception internationally and suggests that this increases the cost of development, and that there's a major risk for developers, and it adds to their costs in that decisions are often challenged and overturned. So the proposal is that we would move to a rules-based system that isn't based on a case-by-case assessment, where government would set out these rules at a national level, and then they could be applied locally through local plans. And the idea is that local plans would be significantly shorter and simpler as well, than removing some of the hurdles for developers. CIEEM, obviously, we responded to the consultation earlier in the year. Some of our views on this are that simplification isn't necessarily a bad thing. The planning system is very old, but it does need to be joined up and thought through. And some of the concerns we have with this is that, well, one major aspect of it is that there's not much thought being given to biodiversity or nature in it. There's a few sort of bits added in here and there, but they're not really joined up and they're not really thought through. The other thing we're going to get onto today is how joined up they are with other things going on at the same time. So the Environment Bill is a good example. We've got Biodiversity Net Gain, nature recovery networks. There's a new amendment on species and site strategies. And then from the Agriculture Bill, we've got environmental land management schemes. At the moment, it doesn't look like these things have been thought through as to how they will overlay with each other. The consultation is very much data-driven as well, as with many things with government. Now we're moving in that direction. That's fine, but they do need to be ground truth, and we need to remember that best available data may still be poor data. Monitoring and enforcement is obviously a major concern for us, and there is a notion in the consultation and the proposals around strengthening enforcement powers and sanctions. But as with all of these things, we know monitoring enforcement is one of those things that comes at the end. Does it always happen? Is there funding for it? Who's doing it? So still a concern there. And then our other major concern is around local planning authorities and them being under-resourced, without expertise and not really having capacity to deliver. So they certainly need help there. So we know there's an argument for change, that we have to change. There's a climate emergency, there's a biodiversity crisis. Government's declared that, CIEEM's declared that, and numerous local councils have declared that. And we know we need to change quickly. There is an urgency here. So how do we achieve a green recovery and build back better? And I will pass over to Julia and we can get this discussion going. Thank you.
Yes, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you here, and many thanks to my panel for joining us. So Biodiversity Net Gain, development that leaves biodiversity in a better state than before. And that requires a different way of thinking, planning, designing, and building our development. And it's really important to notice and talk about and acknowledge that different approach, because net gain is not business as usual and let's run the metric and make sure the numbers tot up. It is that different approach where biodiversity net gain is a core deliverable, a core part of that development right from the start. Now, that different approach has its origins in a very grassroots way within industry, and it's been extraordinary to see individuals up and down the country having that change. But now is the right time. There is variation, there's inconsistency. So now is the right time to bring in the Environment Bill. And as Jason said, the Environment Bill, the mandatory approach to biodiversity net gain, is giving us that level playing field of the numerical definition of a minimum of 10%, the 30-year timeline, and other factors as well. There's still uncertainty there, but we know the mandatory approach to biodiversity net gain is coming. And then we have these planning reforms, and we have this incredible opportunity as we emerge from COVID-19 to really set the scene here. But how's this all going to fit together? And we will be discussing the first one with Bob. So Bob, the first of these key themes, so the key themes, speeding things up, and then we'll go to the different zones of development, and then we'll go to a rule-based system. It's a fair question, right? You know, okay, I'm not going to get into the whole pesky Great Crested Newt discussion, but as a contractor, you know, we do spend quite a lot on consultants. Can you speed up the biodiversity net gain assessment?
That's a very fair question, Julia, and yeah, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk with you all about this topic. I think it's an interesting one. Obviously, everybody's always keen to see that we can move forward a bit quicker with the way that projects run. I've given this bit of thought, and we've bandied around quite a few B-based slogans recently. So we've got Build Back Better, we've got Build, Build, Build. And so I've got my own, and that's what we need to do, is to bake in biodiversity right from the beginning. Okay, so that's good, Bob. That's the important thing we need to do. Is like, if nobody goes away with anything other than your kind of, yeah, political slogan for the day, we need to just make sure that all of our, that the start of the process has got ecologists standing beside the developers and their design team, and they're thinking about ecology right from the beginning. That's how we're going to make things move quicker. Those are the clients that I think will be on the front foot when it comes to developments, and understanding how important the approach to biodiversity net gain is going to be for their future plans. So I think there are other things that are there to, you know, as well as just having ecologists involved earlier on, there are other tools that we have at our disposal that can really help us not just deliver better quality projects, but hopefully and better for biodiversity and for the environment, but also get those projects through the system quicker. So some of the technology that's developed and has changed in recent years is going to really help us. So we have the opportunity now to collect good quality data sets using remote sensed information. Quite a lot of organisations are now flying drones over potential development sites and using that to inform their habitat-based assessments. That will be really useful. It's a lot quicker than having field survey work done early on. We're also using techniques like eDNA, so that's become really well established, used for great crested newts. So that means you get quicker, definitive results, often in a wider survey period than you would do otherwise. So that's a really useful tool for us to use. And alongside eDNA, there's good quality kind of spatial data approaches that we can use. So modeling biodiversity data like species distribution information. And we're already seeing that kind of coming into policy approaches. So in England, Natural England have developed their district licensing approach, and that takes a species distribution model to try and inform where the best place to mitigate for newts are. So that can help things quicker, and not just quicker, but for clients and developers to understand what they're signing up for and what they need to know about before they've got all of the detailed ecological baseline information. So, I mean, there's other aspects out there as well. We've got, as you've already mentioned, good metrics available now, which can really help give us that can really help with kind of understanding things early on in the feasibility stage. And not just biodiversity net metrics, but also metrics around ecosystem services, which helps play to some of the points that Jason raised earlier there about alleviating flood risk, for example.
So just in terms of speeding things up, there's obviously some opportunities there. So I think what you're saying is, what's really interesting, the main thing, if you want to speed us up, talk to us early, plus all these technology aspects that are coming through, and particularly Biodiversity Net Gain is that habitat focused. So there's opportunities, but what are the risks and what are those red lines where, you need boots on the ground? And, we are talking about ecologists who you just need to get out there. So there's the good stuff, but what are there any red lines that we need to draw?
Sure, there's absolutely. It's really important that we're cognizant of the risks that are there in some of these approaches that we're my first thought is that biodiversity net gain and our general approach to biodiversity needs to be driven by good quality data. We've got much better data now in 2020 than we had 10 or 20 years ago, but there are still some pretty enormous gaps there, both in terms of species distribution. We still don't have a decent quality habitat map of Great Britain, for goodness sake. There's so much that needs to be done, but we need good quality data, and that information needs to be collected by specialists and interpreted and assessed by specialists, ecologists, experienced in what they're doing. I have a slight concern that with the availability of tools and the fact that they're free and easy to get hold of, that there might be non-specialists who think that they can run away and do this on their own. And I would say, you need to have that specialist working alongside you and making sure that you don't miss something important.
And is there a sort of a trade-off between getting in there really, really early, and I'm certainly lucky, I do get those lines on the Google map and say, oh Julia, what does this look like for net gain? And I do love that, that's an opportunity to start it early, but I'm very, very careful. And in that moment, you maybe have to go on the worst case. So I normally run different options. Like this could be a worst case option, which is obviously best case for biodiversity, or whatever that might be. For a developer, getting us in really early, are there trade-offs to then looking at net gain down the line?
I guess there might be some. Inevitably, there if you're looking at if the ecologist is in early and is making judgments with a limited data set, then they're inevitably going to, they should be using the precautionary approach in those in that first stages. And you may find that through that precautionary approach that there's actually there's more space in the future as the design develops, that you could have more space for development, for example. But I think on the whole, it's much more important that we have a good look first early on at feasibility stage, and then as the design develops, you can start to see where there are areas to compromise or get better quality biodiversity out at the end of the day.
So, okay, so speeding things up, lots of opportunities there. And I get asked that question a lot. Julia, what's the quick win? What's the easy win with biodiversity net gain? And I generally say, ask us early, because then, you kind of, like you were saying, you speed up down the line. Technology's definitely great. It still tends to be with the big companies at the moment. So for the for the smaller scale projects and everything like that, there's a line there. But also, like I think you were saying, there are lines in the sand. There are those moments that you can't speed up, and you certainly need that. And as an industry, we should stand firm on that.
Absolutely. And I don't, I find it amazing that we're still having conversations about survey periods when they haven't actually changed much in the 20 years I've been in the industry. And it's like, don't come to me and ask for high quality baseline survey work in November, because I'll still not be able to do it till April, and I never have been. So that kind of understanding can really help, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's move on to our second point then. So we looked at speeding things up. Now there are these zones, and Richard, if we can bring you in here. And Richard, thank you so much for stepping in last minute. We don't know that much about these development zones, but we know a little bit that Jason's gone through. What's your take on just how they would work and how they might work with biodiversity net gain?
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I think the first thing to talk about is the growth zone. And really the conversation needs to be more focused on growth and renewal than protect. Growth is when it's baked into a plan, an area where you're going to have, in effect, an outline planning permission. So I'm going to borrow again Bob's point. If you bake in what is effectively an outline planning permission, you've really got to know at that stage in plan making what it is you're going to do in terms of biodiversity. How much is going to be on site? How much can be off site? If off site, where's the clarity of where, what, and how it can be delivered? And these are all things that I think need to be assessed right at the early stage of plan making in order to define an allocation which is akin to an outline planning permission. And you will know from the amount of data that's needed to determine an outline planning permission in terms of the impacts, offsetting the impacts, or compensating, mitigating, or avoiding in the first place, of course, to use the hierarchy that we have in the framework at the moment in paragraph 175. So the key is to get that right at the beginning. There is a massive amount of work to do to get that right at the beginning and to test that you've got it right at the beginning. And I'll just move on briefly to the other zone that's worth mentioning. Renewal, smaller scale, infill development, potentially throwing up very similar issues, but on a smaller scale of development. But at the same time, the likelihood of actually having the data and the information to judge the impact on these smaller, more ad hoc developments where there will be a presumption is even more acute, because whilst it might well be possible to gain data and understanding to work out what's going to be on-site or off-site and how off-site is going to be funded and delivered for a large project that's in a growth area, such as an urban extension, it is much more difficult, simply as a matter of resource, if nothing else, to be able to work out how to deal with those similar, there may be smaller scale issues because of the smaller sites, but there may be millions of them across the country, frankly. And how do you get the data to be able to make a judgment about those in the first place? And how much of it is pushed back to decision making? And of course, if you've got a presumption, it's also broadly akin to an outline. It's not quite as powerful if it's a presumption in favour of development. How then does the detail feed in later? It's a rhetorical question, and the rules will be critical. And of course, being a lawyer, lawyers, like everybody else, we like rules. We like to see where we're going with it. So on-site, off-site, sufficiency of information, baking it in at the beginning of the allocation, and working out how you deliver it.
Yeah, and it's tricky, isn't it? So we've got the thing about speeding up the assessment. So there's things that you can do to get a certain level of data, but then you need those boots on the ground and you need the outline surveys. Often when I'm working with really early stages, there are so many different options of a development that, you know, I will have equally as many options for biodiversity net gain. So I wouldn't want to say this is the one, you know, because it will change. And even through detailed design, when you get on site, there are things that are going to be different and things that are going to influence the net gain design. How do you see that balance working its way through?
We don't know the detail of how the white paper is going to move this on, but I would suggest that there needs to be not quite the full equivalent of an outline planning permission, because there is still, even at plan making stage for a large urban extension, so much still to be understood about a site and how you're going to approach it. So I think there needs to be built into the system, when we learn more about how the white paper evolves and what it really means, a second more detailed check to get the finer grain of how you deal with ecological matters and biodiversity matters on a site for development. It really needs that subsequent check, but that isn't apparent in the white paper at the moment. It isn't written out in the white paper in that way. It's difficult to see how you do refine the information, gather more information, and get to the point where, you know, with an outline planning permission in the traditional sense now, you would expect at the point of getting an outline that you would know the parts of the site that you cannot develop. You would have a very good understanding of the parts of the site that you can develop. You would have a good understanding of those bits you're going to leave alone. What are you going to do with them? And if you are talking about some compensatory provision, is it monetary entirely? Is it clear where the money is going to be spent and what good it is going to do in terms of compensating or offsetting, to use the slightly more old-fashioned term? It just seems that there needs to be another step in the process that doesn't exist in the white paper at the moment.
So if you were, I suppose, given the uncertainties in the white paper and given the unknowns that we have, if you were mapping that process out, what would you want to see?
Sorry, Julia, I missed the opening part of, I think I've got a poor reception.
If you, given that there is uncertainty, so we know there's going to be these growth areas, but there's uncertainty about how that would work, what would your advice be for the government?
I think you've got to move the boundary a little bit between what has traditionally been a reserve matter and what has traditionally been an outline, so that there is more still to be determined at reserve matter stage. Traditionally, we have, in the current system, you cannot go back and revisit matters of principle at reserve matter stage. At reserve matter stage, you should already have from the outline a great deal of information about how key matters can be resolved, and if that can be, if the boundary between where those two overlap with each other can be moved slightly, so that there are things at reserve matter stage that might traditionally have been said to be points of principle for outline, but can still be determined and still be considered with more information. Yes.
So recognising early is good and having that, but things are going to change down the line.
Yes. Yeah. And a refinement of understanding of a site.
Yes, exactly. And keeping on that theme of we've
Julia,
got these...
just before you move on, I think Tom wanted to make a point here.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question really of Richard, if that's okay, Julia. I'm going to jump in. I think this is a really interesting point, because if we are putting more information forward up front in these areas of development, does that then mean, or do you read the paper to suggest that that means actually the local authority are going to have to do a ton of work that at the moment sits with the developer in order to get that information ready to say, yes, this is our growth area and this is what's required from it?
Yes, but I think the expectation from listening to comments made by various people who were on the panel producing the white paper is that the local authority would put some of that burden back to the developer. So if they are thinking in the plan making process of allocating an area of land for growth, let's say a major urban extension, and that site has already been promoted by a developer who has the ability and probably deeper pockets and resource to do a great deal of the work, then that work should be encouraged by the authority of the developer in order to allow them to assess it rather than create it in the first place as part of the allocation process. That seemed to be the answer from Christopher Katkowski QC, who was on the panel when he was asked a similar point. Now, that's not my answer, that's my assessment of what they are thinking.
Okay, that sounds like two assessments by the local authority instead of one for that development then. One at the earlier stage to say, has the developer done the work that they need to do to identify it as a growth area? And then the second one once they put forward their proposal for the development.
Possibly. I mean, normally you have a very simple call for sites type approach right at the beginning when people are invited to put forward sites. I think at that stage, it won't simply be, will you have a look at my site? It will be, will you have a look at my site? Because here is a really well thought through assessment of the site, not just on biodiversity matters, in fairness, on probably every conceivable development topic. Of course, then the burden switches to the authority to look at that information and to appraise it and assess it. So there may not be boots on the ground obtaining it, surveying the site, taking the various bits of information that already exist and adding to it from further survey. But I think they will have to appraise it very carefully and in much more detail than has hitherto been the case.
Thank you. And thank you, Julia, for letting me jump in.
No, I was going to ask you and Bob to come in on this piece. So we've got these zones, particularly the growth zone, and we've got DEFRA's spatial hierarchy for biodiversity net gain. Now, out of everything with the mandatory approach to biodiversity net gain, the one thing that gained most consensus was the focus of biodiversity net gain on or nearby the site. And that's one thing that, all the stakeholders were sort of most aligned with. So my questions to you, right? We know even at the moment before the Environment Bill, developers are already changing behavior. We're seeing that already. We're seeing that some developers doing it very well in terms of shifting their development and designing their development with biodiversity net gain on site. But we are seeing inappropriate ways where we've just got to squeeze that green stuff in to make it fit on site. And I think part of that is the uncertainty and the risk, because if you go off site, there's not offset banks popped up or anything like that. How, knowing that we might have these growth development zones fit in, and there's this apparent conflict with the DEFRA's approach to the biodiversity net gain, what would you want to see, happen with these various growth zones and how it would fit with biodiversity net gain? Tom, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, okay. So there are examples already where land allocation has been identified by local authorities, so allocated for development. And in those sites, somebody has gone out and done a high-level biodiversity net gain assessment at the outset to inform that land allocation, that site, so that those sites, we then understand if you develop that site out and the development is covering a certain proportion of that, we've got a certain proportion of green space in and a certain proportion of gardens, what is the additional requirement needed to deliver biodiversity net gain? And then those local authorities may well set up a bank to deliver those additional units nearby, as perhaps as a country park or something like that. And that allows a very clear way forward for the developer, because they know when they're coming in that they're going to have to deliver X number of units on site and then pay a certain amount for the off-site country park. It also means that that country park can be placed close to the development so that those people living in those houses or impacted by that development can benefit from that country park. And for the local authority, it means that they can be certain that they can open up that development with an easy way through for net gain. Now, that's possible, but this is where my question to Richard was really coming from, because what that means is somebody going out from the local authority or perhaps, as Richard suggests, from the developer, and actually doing that assessment to identify that baseline starting point before you even have allocated that site formally for development. And then also identifying that compensation site. And the example I'm thinking of, I know that there were examples in Teambridge and elsewhere, but that can work really well, but it is quite a lot of work to get that up and running. Yes, does that make sense?
It does. Is that one back for me?
Yes, go on then.
Or at least briefly as an introductory. It seems to me that when you're looking at off-site sites, there are two ways of approaching it. The developer may actually promote as part of their own case an off-site site that they have control over. The local authority may promote an off-site site that they have control over. If there is no control in terms of land control, then there is an issue about how you actually deliver. It could involve compulsory purchase, simply identifying a site and then putting a policy allocation on it doesn't necessarily provide the ability to deliver. But your point, Tom, I think, was who does the work to work out the baseline, to work out the opportunity for improvement, and the realism of improvement. It's going to put a lot of pressure back on the authority, unless to the extent on the very largest schemes, and this won't be the smaller ones, the developer can, as I said earlier, assist in doing some of that to make a case in part of its submissions and representations early on in the plan making process.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where I think that the real risks come in. We know with the Environment Bill, they talk about boosting local planning authority resources, but that was for the Environment Bill, that wasn't for this, and we're now already compounding biodiversity net gain on local planning authorities where many don't have the ecologist or the resources, plus these additional planning reforms, and something's going to give. And it's having that point to start with. And just quickly though, before Bob, just in case your computer boots you out and then you have to come back in. So we'll come back to you, Bob, if you do get cut out. I want to finalise that point on the growth areas, and then we'll move to Tom for the rule-based planning. Growth, to me, reinforces the disconnect between people and nature. This is about emerging back from COVID-19, where I speak to so many people and they have found local green spaces that they never knew existed, and people don't forget that now. We've got this moment to connect with nature, and personally that's quite important to me and how we think about net gain. What would you want that growth zone to be, rather than let's grow development here, and really thinking about the role that net gain can play with that?
I think it's got to be holistic in terms of built form and non-built form from the beginning. I think the implication from the white paper is slightly different, and I think there is a disconnect between that and the whole biodiversity net gain piece. The implication from the white paper seems to be, well, payment of money for something to be done somewhere that will offset, that will deal with the loss plus gains, will be the panacea, will be the answer. And I can't see that being an appropriate approach, because you'll just end up with large amounts of growth, which might be a good thing in itself, it's meeting an objective, but large amounts of growth that could be otherwise a bit of a green desert. There is no green, it's all development. It would inevitably have its own areas of green space, you would expect, but green space manufactured to be part of the usable open space of a development is not the same as biodiversity.
Yeah, exactly. Green
not
space
in every respect.
Manufactured, exactly. And just before we finally move on to the rules-based system, Bob, was there any final points you wanted to make on the zone bit?
Yeah, so I think just to pick up on one of the things Tom mentioned there about, or you were both talking about biodiversity net gain sites being located close to developments. I think some of that's going to fall back onto local authorities and making sure that any compensation is ecologically meaningful. And that does mean, so that's probably the phrase that I keep coming back to. It's not about where it is, it's about whether it delivers what it's meant to do, and whether it can be put in place for the long term. And also that it fits in well with what the stakeholders want to see. So I think if they get those two things right, those are, in my view, more important than exactly where it is. If you get those two bits right, then I think it's more likely to be effective for biodiversity.
Which brings us on nicely to the rules-based system. So, Tom, we don't know much about what these rules will be. Personally, I love a good set of rules, and the thought of having rules for biodiversity net gain is delightful, I have to be honest. We've had these principles in industry. No, let's turn them into rules. But if we're looking at a planning reform and we're looking at rules for that, what would you want to see with biodiversity net gain?
Yeah, that's a great question. So firstly, just you're right, the rules are not clear at the moment. The suggestion is we move to a rule-based system rather than a policy-based system. so that suggests something where the rule is either we've passed or we've failed or we've delivered against that rule or we haven't, rather than a policy that allows flexibility and change at a local level. Firstly, before I just want to say one thing before that. I think there's a really interesting point here that, firstly, this is apparently a once in a generation change to the planning system, which I think that was also said in 2010 when the NPPF was updated and then published in 2012. So it's interesting to see that once in generation opportunities come around about once every 8 years, which is certainly speeding something up. And then we've got this ambition to replace the entire corpus of plan making law. Now that is audacious, isn't it? I mean, the entire corpus. Would we ever do that with any other part of our legal system? Say, okay, we're going to replace everything. I'm not sure we would. And also, I'm not sure that this really is going to do that. So, and this, bear with me for a moment, because this will come back to these rules, because we may well see a radical shift in the Town and Country Planning Act. It may be completely changed, completely new name, new branding, new whole legislation. But that doesn't mean that all of the environmental legislation or all of the health and well-being legislation or all of the other acts that are around this and feed into that Town and Country Planning Act will have changed. I don't believe that this white paper's ambition is to change all of those other laws. And the reason the Town and Country Planning Act has been updated so many times, and the NPPF was only updated last year, wasn't it? 2019, the most recent update. The reason those updates are happening is because of that other law, in part, you know, the habitat regulations coming in and so on. So we've already got a whole set of legislation that needs to be part of this and will then inform the rules or policy or whatever we call it. So we don't know what these rules are, and yet we've already got a set of rules there that says, well, we're still going to have to meet our habitat regulations requirements. We're still going to need to meet the requirements that are set out within the Environment Bill and so on. So those could form potentially part of those rules. Our ambition for net zero carbon could form part of those rules, but we really don't know. So there's a big unknown there. Then if we come back to biodiversity net gain, I think there's a real opportunity here because biodiversity net gain is mentioned in the white paper. It's really clearly set out that that's an ambition. They also talk about net gain in a more broader sense and a positive impact on beauty. And I think, as an aside, having a rule based on beauty is a really tricky one, isn't it? Because frankly, isn't it in the eye of the beholder anyway? But biodiversity net gain perhaps does leap into that position where we can have a rule about it. We can have a rule, and the Environment Bill will set out a requirement for all development under the Town and Country Planning Act to deliver biodiversity net gain, a simple rule. We could equally have a rule that said every development has to meet its environmental requirements under the habitat regulations. Now, the subtlety underneath that is that that's a lovely, simple rule, isn't it? But the detail underneath that is going to be just as complex as it is now. We're not going to remove all of that subtlety around whether, how we're dealing with the newts or what we've got to do for the bats and so on and so on. That's all going to still be there. So we can have a simple rule, but that's just covering up the complexity underneath it potentially. Biodiversity net gain does also allow us to start talking about this really early on and speed some things up. So this links up with the work that we've already heard about speeding things through the process, and also these different zones or areas. We could do these biodiversity net gain assessments early. We could allow that to form part of the rule to say, yes, we can then define this as a growth area and allow growth in that area. But there's this balance between detailed information early on and the work to get that up front and clear, or less information early on, meaning that we can speed things through more quickly, but having greater risk later on in the process, which is what you were really talking about at the start of this, Julia, greater risk to that development that something's going to come up that we've missed. Suddenly we found that there's the horrid spider is found on this site, and suddenly we have to change development because it's the only site in the UK that it's found, or whatever it might be. Now that I think that's probably not the best example because we know where that spider is, but those types of things will come up, and we mustn't let this idea that this rule-based system is going to solve all of that. I don't think it will.
I think that's such a valid point. The wording has been a rule-based system to provide clarity, to provide certainty, all of those aspects, whereas we're still dealing with nature, and we're still dealing with the complexities of changing design and uncertainties and things you can get on site. So are you saying that there's a risk that it will, I suppose there's a risk that we're promising the simplicity of solving those pesky great crested newts, when actually it just requires really good upfront data collection, ecologists from the start, and a comprehensive approach?
Yeah, I mean, if we were able to go out and do all of the survey work that we do at the moment as part of the development project up front, and then identify those growth areas, great. Then we can speed through that development really easily because we've got that level of information, and we can use the stuff that Bob was talking about around eDNA, remote sensing, and so on to inform that and help build that. But that work still needs to be done somewhere. Yeah, it's still needed in order to meet all of that wider legislation that we've already got, whether it be the Environment Bill, HABS regs, and so on, all of the other pieces. Those aren't going to go away just because we rewrite the Town and Country Planning Act.
And I think the rule piece for me when it comes into biodiversity net gain is about that clarity on what that 10% is. So it's not being allowed to swap ponds with trees, because ponds are pretty quick and easy to get your units, and providing that structure as well, because even I see this, even with that 10% mandatory approach, there's layers underneath that. And what developers that I see really need a clear understanding is not, Julia, are you making this up? Or is having that very strong ruled and structured approach, so they know that right from the start. And so much at the moment I see these brilliant, brave ecologists having those patient discussions with taking developers, and it's understandable, but taking developers through that uncertainty piece and having that set out from the start. What do we mean by true biodiversity net gain might help.
I absolutely agree. I can't see that being held within this new legislation personally, because I think that's quite a lot of detail. I think there might be a requirement for 10% net gain, but the detail about what that actually means and making sure that we meet those detailed rules around like for like or better and so on, we're not going to get it. We're not going to get in the detail in that. I don't think in that overarching legislation.
So we'll see. So
especially if we're aiming for a shorter, more succinct piece of policy or legislation, which seems to be the ambition.
Exactly. So final points, and then I know we've got a couple of questions coming in. Can I ask you, all of the panel members, okay, we know we've got biodiversity net gain on this side, we've got the planning reforms and the uncertainty, something's going to change. And for you, 2 questions: what do we truly need to work on for a green recovery? Bob, can we start with you?
Sure. Hi there. Right. Sorry. Yes, I've had to rejoin on my phone. I think one of the main things there is around capacity in the profession of ecology. I think that's probably my main takeaway there is more ecologists doing more high quality work will help us answer these questions and deliver good evidence to create better places and better development.
Richard.
Yeah, it's to repeat a point from earlier, it's all about getting the best knowledge and the best understanding upfront as soon as possible, because it's going to end up being baked into plan making. It's going to end up being very critical to the beginning of the process, because the end of the process won't produce the right results without it.
Tom.
I think that we need to build nature into places in a way that we haven't been doing to date, which means taking more space for development to allow for that green infrastructure and biodiversity to be an integral part of our built environment, so that we can deliver flood relief, improvements to air quality, decreasing the heat island effect, as well as biodiversity net gain. And that means dissolving this line between this is a growth area, this is a protect area. We need to actually build in a way that allows both of those things to coexist, which is a completely different view from where we are at the moment with this paper.
Okay, and so practical take-homes that people listening can start today. If you'd have to give practical advice for people on what can they do to help this green recovery, Bob.
I guess I'm making the assumption that the bulk of the people on the call will be professional ecologists and members of CIEEM. I would probably advise them to kind of get in touch with their clients now and their potential clients, and talk to them about how important it is to get these things done early.
Yes. So that client engagement piece and working your way through that, which can be hard work. I've had many a conversation that went absolutely nowhere, but then you get that one conversation that makes a difference. Richard.
I'm going to approach it from a slightly different point of view, from a developer's point of view, because it's relevant to everybody. But if a developer is looking at something, one of the first questions, it seems to me, is how much am I going to put on site and how much am I going to put off site? What's the best balance? And if I need off site, then what and where? Because I may need to get into other land alongside the area that I'm intending to develop. And the sooner I know that, and the sooner I can get a position on it, the better.
Tom.
I think both Richard and Bob have made very good points. And to me, I'm just going to reinforce the point they've made. Whether you're a developer, whether you're the local authority ecologist or in a consultancy, it's about that really early engagement to identify what's on site, what's needed, and how you can deliver the best outcomes on that development for biodiversity and the local people and so on. That early engagement and that early insight into what's on the land is crucial.
Jason, in a final moment, I know that I think there's been a pretty good question that's come in. Would you mind kind of taking us through that question?
So we've got a couple of questions. Let's go through the one from Louise first. So, well, thanking the panel, and then talking about the 10% gain and whether there might be an opportunity to have different mandatory percentages for different growth zones. My understanding is it's going to be 10% across the board, but we can have a conversation about that. And whether biodiversity net gain needs to be as local as possible.
I mean, before I open it up, I think this comes back to that that growth area, and the concern that I have is that it will get that disconnect even more so. As we emerge from COVID-19, never before have people had that connection with nature on, and just even with their home. And I was speaking with people who are now, absolutely going out every day, putting up bird feeders and, just little changes like that. And, that wording of the growth zone and what that brings in is that concern. And I think we've got to stand even more firm on the promises of the mandatory approach to the biodiversity net gain to deliver net gain locally as possible.
Shall I come in, Julia, jump in on the biodiversity, the 10% and different growth areas? So my understanding is that the 10% within the Environment Bill is the minimum. So that's the starting point. So it's absolutely for local authorities to set their targets as they see fit. And some are setting targets that are higher than 10% to start with everywhere. And some are being specific by location. So I know that some places that have garden villages or whatever we might call them are setting higher targets at 25%, for example. So there's no reason why different areas could have different targets. Having said that, if you've got a protect area, you're already starting from quite a high baseline, so a 25% increase on something that's already quite good could be much more challenging than a higher percentage in the area that's a growth area where you might be starting with lower biodiversity. But that doesn't mean that you can't set those different targets.
Julia, we've just about run out of time, but we've got one last question that I think would be really important for us to actually have a stab at. So from Alison, we've got, what advice would you give to local planning authorities who are starting their local plan reviews and allocating sites now in terms of data and survey needed, but they don't have an in-house ecologist? Where do they start?
Good. I would suggest, so Jason, I think perhaps a good way to start would be for them to look at collating together good quality spatial data from other sources. So even if they don't have in-house ecologists, they must have spatial specialists in GIS. There's lots of good quality data out there, and actually pulling that together would probably help.
And they might not have their own in-house ecologist, but they might have a local Natural England team, and they might have a local wildlife group or trust or nature conservation partners. And I've seen the real magic happen when there's that collaboration across the piece, and bringing those people together. What do we want for nature in this patch? And remembering that biodiversity net gain is only making things better. We're not making things the best that we can be. So having that set out and having as many people around the table set out that vision, I think will be the best thing. So reach out, collaborate. It can often be a good way.
I think that's a really great point to end on. So, so we'll end it there. Thank you very much to the panel. A special thank you to Richard for stepping in at a very last minute. And thank you to all of you for joining us and your questions. Yeah, thank you very much and stay safe. Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks.